In the first part of today's mini-lecture, I introduced you to philosophy as a discipline. In the second part, I hope to give you some idea of the specific area of philosophy we will be studying this semester, namely, ethics. So then, let's begin. In the last 5 years, I have moved many times. However, I have always brought one item with me, an item that reminds me both to be creative and that a little eccentricity never hurt anyone. The item is a poster depicting Einstein. In it, he sits with his legs crossed, smoking a pipe, hair askew in the way we expect Einstein's hair to be. Across the picture are printed some of the great scientists' famous quotations. My favorite has always been the one about truth. In this quote, Einstein muses, "It is difficult to say what a truth is, but sometimes it is easy to recognize a falsehood." I think this is very insightful. It does indeed seem easier to recognize wrongs than rights, to recognize what something isn't, than what something is. I thus greatly respect Poiman's introduction to our textbook. Indeed, Poiman here defines ethics not in positive terms, but rather in negative ones. He introduces us to ethics by showing us what it is not. In doing so, I feel like he gives us a far better idea of the subject than if he had simply defined it. I'm not going to go back over Poiman's introduction here. I have instead posted a rather detailed outline of it on today's PowerPoint. In this lecture, then, I'm going to offer you another approach to ethics, another way of understanding what it is, by walking you through what it isn't. Namely, I hope to offer you a brief outline of the various branches of philosophy, the branches of logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and finally ethics, with the hope that by understanding these other areas' main concerns, you will get a better idea of what ethics is and is not concerned about. First of all, then, logic. Logic is, to put it simply, the study of proper and improper argumentation. I should note here that when philosophers use the term argument, we are not referring to fistfights, shouting matches, or broken beer bottles. Well, at least not most of the time. Typically, though, when a philosopher uses the word argument, he or she simply means a proof. An argument is an ordered sequence of statements that are intended to prove something to an audience. It is the logician's job to analyze these. Needless to say, a logician's job is not half exciting as a magician's, despite the fact that their similar-sounding job titles could be mistaken for each other in casual conversation. The second major area of philosophy is epistemology. Epistemology sounds kind of like something halfway to a crude joke, but is in fact nothing more than the study of knowledge. It is also, I might add, the area of philosophy I find the most interesting. In order to tell you a little about it, however, I'm going to forego repeating the information I've already posted to PowerPoint, and instead tell you a story that captures both what epistemology is all about and also a little bit of the excitement of philosophical study. Back about 20 or 30 years ago, there was a group of philosophers teaching at a small college. Like many philosophers, they loathed time spent in the office, and so spent the majority of their days at the local pub across the street from the college, putting back pints and pondering ponderous epistemological problems. As was bound to happen, the dean got on their case. "You guys have to do something," the dean said, "or we're going to have to let you all go." And so the leader of the group, Professor Gettier, stepped up to bat. He decided to take on the biggest problem he could find, the definition of knowledge itself. The definition had stood since Aristotle. For 2,000 years, philosophers had basically agreed that for something to count as knowledge, it had to be true, you had to have a reason for it, and you had to actually believe it. Professor Gettier thought for a while, probably back to one of his many pub conversations, and came up with a scenario like this following one. Let's say there's a room full of people. A couple minutes ago, Tom came up to me to show me a Rolex on his wrist. After looking at it, I exclaim, "I know at least one person in this room has a Rolex." The thing is, Tom's Rolex is a Mexican knockoff, and I don't know it. The other thing is, and I don't know this either, old Jerry in the corner has the real deal strapped on. So, Gettier continues, in this situation, my claim that one person in the room has a Rolex is perfectly true. I completely believe it, and I have good reason for believing it. But, given all the facts, it seems like you wouldn't want to say, "I know that someone in the room has a Rolex." Gettier's paper was only 2.5 pages long. It succeeded in both securing his job and destroying 2,000 years of epistemology. Philosophers have yet to recover from the blow. Moving on then to the third major area of philosophy, metaphysics. If you know your prefixes, you can guess the topic of this field. Meta simply means above, or perhaps more accurately, beyond. Metaphysics is thus the study of that which is beyond the physical world. By this, I don't mean that metaphysicians are like philosophical ghost hunters. Rather, metaphysicians study that which the study of the physical world presupposes, the questions that must be assumed to be answered before the physicists and biologists even begin working. Thus, metaphysicians ask questions like, why is the universe ordered in such a way that it can be studied? Why is there something to be studied in the first place? And is there some sort of God at the center of it all, or just chaos? In short, metaphysicians ask questions of the sort you do not have to be a hippie to describe as far out. Which brings us at long last to ethics. Having differentiated it from logic, epistemology, and metaphysics, we can see that ethics is not primarily concerned with the form of argumentation, the structures of knowledge, or the big questions about the universe. Rather, as Poyman puts it, it is concerned with what we ought to be, rather than whether what ought to be, rather than that what is. As such, ethics is concerned first and foremost with investigating how we are to act in the world, rather than how we are to understand this world. Of course, ethics cannot be done in isolation from the other philosophical fields. It needs logic to structure its arguments. It needs a theory of knowledge to rest upon, for its convictions to rest upon. It needs to know something about the world before it attempts to explain how we should live and act within it. In determining what ought to be, ethics must thus ask two basic questions. The first is, what is the good life? The second is, how does one achieve this good life? Since ethics is all about achieving some sort of good life, the first question determines the goal of ethics. It would do you good to think about what such a good life would look like. Is it decreasing suffering in the world? Is it living for a worthy cause? Is it living a life of humility? Or is it potentially closer to 50 Cent's imperative to get rich or die trying? The philosophers we will look at this semester will all offer a different answer. You should come up with one as well. The second question ethics asks to determine what ought to be. The question, how does one achieve the good life, asks how one achieves the goal determined by the first question. If the good life consists in, let's say, decreasing suffering in the world, how does one go about doing this? Should one quit school, join the Peace Corps, and begin an AIDS prevention program in Africa? Or should one take the time to get educated so one can know better how to alleviate suffering? Again, there are an infinite number of ways to answer these questions. I hope, however, this class introduces you to the ways people have typically and traditionally answered them. Furthermore, I hope that these traditional responses will help you answer the questions for yourself. One of the first recorded analysis of the good life is found in Plato's Crito, so that is where we are going to turn to in the next segment of today's mini lecture.